Live, the solar eclipse, because this is what we do.
Mid-morning with Mike Graham. Talk Radio.
Let us, without further ado, go to Helen Dale. We're keeping our eyes on Matt Hancock for you, of course, as well. If anything happens in those hearings, at the moment, nothing really much has happened. But if anything does, we will bring it to you immediately. Let us first, though, go to Helen Dale, a former, I would say, former alma mater of yours at Oxford, of course. Helen, you've been to many institutions of higher learning, I'm sure. Oxford probably wasn't like this when you were there.
No, it wasn't. And I've taught at Oxford as well. I was a tutor at my college, which was Brasenose, not Oriel. And so before I make some observations on this, because I do think the behaviour is very bad, I want to bracket a couple of things off.
Yeah.
I didn't go to Oriel, although I have been in tutorial rooms at Oriel. I went to Brasenose. And I was not, and although it is relatively common among Australians, I was not one of the Australians who was a Rhodes Scholar.
Right.
To be a Rhodes Scholar, you have to be under 25. And when I went up, because I already had a degree from my Australian university, from the University of Queensland, I had already turned 25. So I was actually ineligible. I couldn't even apply for a Rhodes Scholarship. I won a scholarship known as a Clarendon Scholarship, which is actually funded by Oxford University Press.
Well, one of the more famous Rhodes Scholars, I suppose, would be Bill Clinton.
Yes.
You know, who apparently enjoyed his time there very much.
Bob Hawke, the Australian Prime Minister, was a Rhodes Scholar. Malcolm Turnbull, also an Australian Prime Minister, was a Rhodes Scholar.
Yeah.
And as you can see, this is bipartisan. Bob Hawke was a Labor Prime Minister. Malcolm Turnbull was a coalition Prime Minister, the Australian equivalent of the Tories.
Yes.
So it's not one side or the other, you know, Bill Clinton being a Democrat or anything. I'm sure there are plenty of Republicans who've become Rhodes Scholars. It was never, ever, either the Rhodes or the Clarendon, which have very similar rules, were never, ever set up to be one way or the other. It was just meant to be for students of great promise to go to do a degree at the University of Oxford. Right.
And now what we have, after I thought things had taken a bit of a turn for the better when the university decided to keep the Cecil Rhodes statue up in the city of Oxford, because let's face it, it's visible to the public on the basis that it's on the outside of a building.
It's on the outside wall of Oriel College.
But it's also quite high up. So I mean, if you were looking to be offended by a statue, you'd actually have to look for it before you could become offended.
Because they've got a whole frontage of statues. I don't know. In the front of Oriel. Yeah. Oriel's one of the historic colleges. It's like Brasenose. It's full of old stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why this has the college has come to this decision, even though they are themselves quite conflicted about the legacy of Cecil Rhodes, is precisely because it is a grade 1 or grade A heritage listed building. And the BBC for once very helpfully reported all the approvals they would have to go through in order to get that statue removed. Never mind the cost, just the approvals, including ministerial approval. And we now know that the position that the Tories have taken on this. And so I'm quite confident if that landed on Oliver Dowden's desk, he would just be saying, no, get stuffed. This is ridiculous.
And I'm pleased to see the government and ministers actually doing that, because there are some ministers who you would be surprised might be frightened of doing that.
Yes, that is true. And I mean, I will say, and try not to be overly defensive of where I went to university, but I will point out this is 150 academics. I have the complete list in front of me. Yes, Oxford. I used to teach there. Oxford leaks like a sieve. I have talked to a former colleague, and I now have the full list.
And it's not a confidential document by any means.
No, it's not. It was it was put up on the Oxford internal communication system, basically the university intranet.
Right.
It was really not hard to get.
So the names are not particularly under protection of any kind.
No. I mean, I'm going to name a couple of people, but I discussed this with the colleague before I came on to talk on the Independent Republic. My personal view is that the people who should be named and shamed on this are the senior people. So, and there does seem to be a nexus of it at Worcester College and at St Anthony's College.
Right.
I mean, I will note that the one relatively, well, not very senior, but one relatively senior person from my college, Brasenose, has really engaged in quite a serious bit of virtue signalling, because this individual doesn't even teach, has signed this petition saying, I won't teach at Oriel, and this person is in a field for a degree, for a course that Oriel doesn't even offer.
Right.
So this person is literally doing the ultimate empty virtue signal.
Yes.
So that's all I'm going to say.
So that's a bit like me saying I'm not going to make the papal address from the Vatican City this year.
Yes, I'm not going to go to work. I, Mike Graham, am not going to go to work at LBC.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's certainly true.
You know. And that's certainly true, isn't it? It's just silly nonsense.
Yeah.
You know, it's but you know, we've got Kate Tunstall here, Professor of French at Worcester College.
I thought she was pop star, Katie Tunstall.
And we've got Mars Lama, Professor of African History at St Antony's College. I'm dropping the senior people in it.
Right.
You know, we've got Anna Laura Wainwright, Professor of the Human Geography of China, St Cross College. Has she taken any money from the Confucius Institute?
I certainly hope not.
That'd be a good question to ask, wouldn't it?
It would.
You know.
Well, this is where the hypocrisy of so many of these institutions, I find, is hard to bear, because most of them, almost every single senior chair in most of the Oxford University colleges now has been sponsored by someone, and many of them have been sponsored by the Chinese government or elements of Chinese, shall we say, commercial operations which are linked closely to the Chinese government.
I mean, and this is something I can comment on because it involved my Australian university, the University of Queensland. An incident occurred last year when there was real controversy in Australia over the Confucius Institutes, where there was a protest and a counter-protest by two opposed groups of Chinese students, one pro-CCP and one anti-CCP, all of them studying at the University of Queensland, trying to beat the snot out of each other in the Great Court. You know, the UQ is built like a Cambridge college, really, with a very, very big quadrangle in the middle. And they were having basically a punch-up, a massive punch-up in the middle of the Great Court at the University of Queensland. And it was all had roots in this Confucius Institute nonsense and sponsoring academic chairs. And look, this is one that the Tories have to take a hit on. People of my political persuasion have proposed and supported the quasi-commercialisation of universities, and it's compromised them.
Yeah.
And so they've bought into the same kind of woke capitalism that you're seeing all the virtue signalling from
and it's ruining their sort of intellectual critical capabilities, it seems to me. I'm just going to take a brief moment, Helen, before we carry on. I don't know if you can see what we can see, but the eclipse is ongoing, which is getting quite exciting for us here at News UK, because the moon is moving in front of the sun.
Is it going to be a total eclipse?
Well, it's not, no, but look at it now. Where you can see it's gone behind the shard.
It's gone behind the shard,
so
yes,
it's
I can see it behind the shard.
It's now starting to look like something out of a Led Zeppelin concert. It's taking me back to Nebworth, 1979.
And all the stage smoke.
That's right. I've had to see
smoke.
Jimmy Page coming out with his bow and his guitar. Absolutely amazing stuff. Anyway, sorry, I think that the whole idea now and you're quite right to use the word compromised, because clearly academia now in this country has been compromised, if not by shall we say foreign influence and money, but by this kind of woke agenda, which means that how can you teach history, for example, in a college in Oxford if you are campaigning to remove a statue of one of the historical figures who actually helped to create what you're doing?
Well, yes, it's cutting your own feet out from under you. About the only consolation I will say on this is that you've got 150 people who signed this. A significant proportion of them are very junior, so they're like DPhil students. I mean, I was a DPhil student, and that does make you very junior. Even if they were all tenured academics, to use the American shorthand, you've got 150 of them, and there are roughly between 1,900 and 2,000 tenured scholars at the University of Oxford. So you're only dealing with about 8%. And there does seem to be, and a couple of people have made this observation to me, there does seem to be a sort of nexus of signatures from certain colleges. You know, like there's Kellogg, there's Worcester, there's St Antony's. Yeah, so and it does. And the thing is, you do get with this petition culture, it becomes very difficult to say no if everybody on your staircase or in your corridor has signed a particular petition. I mean, even I've had that experience, and I didn't sign it.
Yes.
And it was about.
Well, we saw that. So I don't know. You might not have listened this morning, but Julie Hartley-Brewer had on the student from Edinburgh who's just been found to be, shall we say, not guilty of creating some kind of a storm because of what she said, which angered the trans lobby. But she basically said to Julia that she's been ostracised by most of her class colleagues because either they don't think that she was right or they're frightened of being associated with her because she's got these outlandish views.
Well, you get this very, very serious problem of guilt by association.
Yes.
And I mean, I remember I just said, no, I don't sign petitions, and I don't, you know. And and I know a number of academics who are friends of mine who've just got a policy of refusing to sign open letters because they don't think that's the way academic discourse should be conducted. It should be conducted in the pages of academic journals where it's peer reviewed, you know, rather than people lobbing mortars at each other over the college walls. It's just ridiculous. So I do think it is important to put it in context. You're dealing with less than 10%, but even so, that's 8% of the college, and particularly a concentration at certain colleges, admittedly in what I would consider to be relatively weaker disciplines. But the thing is, you have to be even to get into a discipline that if it were a former poly or a red brick or even a red brick university at Oxford, you just have to be so clever. They often demand 3 and 4 A's at A level, and it's called A stars they call it now. Sometimes there weren't any A stars when I went through. It was all A was the best mark you could get, and it's just so even to do a course that's considered a bit of a dud course at Oxford or Cambridge, you have to be so very clever. And there is a part of me, and if there are any people listening to the Independent Republic on this issue who do have children who are going to be bright enough to get into Oxford or Cambridge, if you are offered a place at Oxford or Cambridge and it's in one of these sort of waffly studies disciplines that's full of wokies, and offered a place in a professional course like law or medicine or engineering or accountancy at a red brick, so one of the 19th century universities or the London universities, my instinct would be to take do the professional qualification at the red brick rather than the woke nonsense at Oxford or Cambridge. I actually think this woke nonsense is such drivel that you would be better off not going to one of the historic
I think you're
universities.
absolutely right. I'm just going to ask you to stop for a second, Helen, because we're going to go live now to the rooftop camera here at News UK, because the eclipse at its highest point is about to happen, we believe, and it's where the moon will be covering the first sort of third of the sun. It has gone behind the Shard at the moment, which is in some ways great, in other ways not so great, because obviously we want to see it if we can see it. And we're going to be trying to bring you that as it happens, as soon as it does happen, because, this sort of thing only happens every few years. And if you'd like me to give you a few tips on what happens, right? Odd effects, apparently, of the eclipse. Here on Earth, scientists have proved that eclipses have a fairly obvious effect. Temperatures will fall by as much as 3 degrees. In some places. If you're out and about and you're watching it, and you can watch it now live as we're seeing it outside the News UK headquarters here in London, winds will normally strengthen. It will suddenly get a lot colder. Most intriguing, however, is evidence that the Earth's gravity changes wherever the eclipse's shadow passes over us. The fall in temperature caused by the shadow generates gravitational waves that have been detected by ultra-sensitive barometers, right? And so it could last as long as about another hour or so, possibly longer. So wherever you are, just keep looking up at the sky and you should be able to see what is actually going on. We can see it peeking out now from behind the side of the Shard, which is a very tall building here in London. It used to be the tallest building in London, but there's one that's just gone up directly opposite our office here, which is the first building, I think, in London to be completely and utterly adapted for facial recognition as you walk into it. So we can see the sun, we can see it glimmering. It's a very cloudy day today, but suddenly you can actually see the eclipse happening. If you're watching our show, if you're watching it on YouTube, if you're watching it right now on Twitter, you should be able to see it happening even as we speak. Lots going on. We're talking to Helen Dale as well. We'll go back to Helen. We'll come to Matt Hancock as well, of course, when we can, when we've got something to tell you. We'll be talking to Peter Cardwell about that as well. But as we talk to Helen, I think we can keep the moon up, the moon and the sun, because it's getting very bright over there on the right. Helen, sorry about that. I just needed to tell people to keep it. It's quite fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Well, no, there was a moment there. I don't know whether other people could see this, and it's very difficult to sort of switch between radio and broadcast and then TV broadcast.
It's not for us, it's not. We're very versatile here.
But there was a moment there where it really did look like Mordor. You know, the tower in Mordor.
It did. That's the thing. I mean, it gives you...
out of the movies.
Yeah, the thing I love about this kind of event is that it brings you... Everybody sees it very differently. Somebody told me earlier it looked a bit like something out of Pac-Man, because you've got the circle of the sun with a little chunk taken out of it, you know?
Yeah. You can see a little bit of that now.
Let me ask you, while we're on the subject of Oxford, to move on just to another subject that I wanted to get your opinion on, really, because it's been a big story this week here, because it's not only asked the question of whether we should be allowing dangerous criminals back out onto the streets, but whether, in fact, life should mean life, and the whole idea of life without parole. And I wondered what you made of that and what you thought about that.
Well, I mean, the broad problem with mandatory sentences, with removing judicial discretion, is that you finish up with situations like emerged in the United States with the 3 strikes rule, where someone would commit 2 relatively serious offences and then shoplift, and they would finish up in jail for life for shoplifting, that kind of thing. So I'm opposed as a headline thing to mandatory sentences, but I don't have a problem with very heavy sentences. But I acknowledge that heavy sentences, very long sentences, are expensive. And one of the things that has been exposed during the coronavirus pandemic, but also before it, is that we have not spent enough money on the prison estate. There's a former prison governor who you can get on Talk Radio. His name is Ian Atchison, and he's on Twitter. You'll be able to find him. And he's a retired prison governor, and he's very knowledgeable about this issue. So I mean, if you're going to make life mean life, money has to be spent on the prison estate. And this is one where law and order Tories sometimes get their wires crossed. Money also needs to be spent on legal aid, because one of the problems of the underfunding of legal aid, one of the things that it leads to, is trials are constantly delayed and delayed and delayed. And basically one of the surest findings we know, if anyone has ever practiced at the bar knows this, is that the longer the lapse of time is between when the event took place and then when the trial happens, basically the quality of the evidence, and particularly the eyewitness evidence, just continues to degrade. It is in the interests of incarceration of dangerous criminals, so therefore in the interests of wider society, for all of the legal aid cuts to be reversed and a very significant amount of money put into the courts, this is going to be not cheap, to ensure that trials can take place in a timious fashion. All those stories about backlogs in the NHS, they've taken cancer backlogs particularly, they've taken headlines, and that's fair enough because we are dealing with matters of life and death. But the rule of law is almost as important as the NHS, and many lawyers would say it's more important. You know, without the rule of law, you don't have an economy. Without an economy, you don't have the NHS. You know, all of that kind of thing.
But the other thing
There's
about
been an enormous backlog in the courts as well.
Oh, there is.
So,
I mean, we talk to barristers all the time who tell us that there's a terrible backlog, and in some ways it may never be caught up because most courts are not even capable of opening properly at the moment, and haven't even before the pandemic. It was already a problem. But Colin Pitchfork and his particular case, I mean, yes, you're right to say that indeterminate sentences and very long sentences cost money, but in his case, he will need to be given a new identity. He will need to be monitored. You know, so releasing him is also going to cost quite a lot of money as well, because there will need to be all these safeguards put into place.
It's the same problem, although a little less complex, because you are at least dealing with someone who didn't commit the crime when he was a juvenile. But there is an analogy to be made with the James Bulger case, and those 2 young men had to be given new identities, and then there was the persistent problem with one of them being involved in the downloading of child pornography, and also being unable to keep a still tongue in his head and letting it slip in the pub to somebody under the influence of drink, no doubt, who he really was. I mean, this is actually, it's like witness protection. It's actually much, much harder than people think it is, because it depends on someone who is not stable. I mean, people who commit these kinds of crimes are not stable. They are not normal. Those crimes are unusual. Continuing to behave in a very, very controlled fashion that many normal, completely normal, non-criminal, ordinary members of the public would struggle with.
Yes.
It's actually very hard to do well.
It is. It's extremely hard to do well. Helen, listen, we've got to leave it there because the moon is suddenly getting very exciting again. So we've pretty much reached the end. But thank you so much, as ever, Helen Dale, with her thoughts on a great many things. Let's have a quick look at the state of the sky, because the moon and the sun have now moved slightly over, so they're not completely covered by the shard. And that is